Welcome back to Backspace Academy. In this lecture on Route 53, I'm going to give you an overview of the service to lead you into the highly available and fault-tolerant lab that we've got that discusses this in quite in-depth detail, and you get to have some very in-depth hands-on knowledge from that. We'll go through what is Route 53, the domain name registration service that is within Route 53, Route 53 hosted zones, what are they, how do we use them, and how do we add record sets to them? The routing policies that are available for us to route traffic through our domain. And DNS failover, what happens when something goes wrong? How can we use Route 53 to redirect our traffic to a standby location? Amazon Route 53, it's a highly available and scalable cloud domain name system, or DNS. As a web service, you pay only for the hosted zones you configure and the number of queries that Amazon Route 53 answers. It provides three main functions: domain name registration, which is a registering of new domain names and the transfer of domain names or existing domain names to AWS, and of course vice versa. It routes internet traffic to the resources for your domain, and that can be public and private hosted zones. So it can be private hosted zones within your own VPC, your private VPC. And the types of routing that are available is latency-based routing, geolocation routing, and weighted round robin routing. And we'll talk about that in a future slide. You can also check the health of your resources and implement DNS failover in the event that your resource becomes unhealthy. The domain name registration service, I'd thoroughly recommend that you use that if you're going to be purchasing a domain name. AWS's prices are very reasonable, and it certainly does create a very streamlined process if you do that. AWS automatically creates a hosted zone for the domain name, and the resource record sets can be created immediately after you've received your email notification of your domain name registration. Privacy protection is implemented by default for Whois queries, and you can transfer the domain to another AWS account simply by contacting AWS. A hosted zone is a collection of resource record sets for a specific domain. A public hosted zone defines the domain and subdomain routing for internet traffic. When you create a public hosted zone, AWS automatically creates name server and start of authority records. A private hosted zone can also be created, and private hosted zones are domain and subdomain routing for traffic within one or more Amazon VPCs. So you can actually set up a domain name inside your VPC that can direct internal traffic based on that domain name. So you need to set enable DNS host names and enable DNS support in your VPC settings to use private hosted zones in Route 53. There are a number of routing policies that we can use within Route 53. The first one being simple routing policy, and that is just directing traffic to a single resource and having no other resources or any backup or anything like that. We can also have weighted routing policies, and what they are is that we would have multiple resources and we can define the amount of traffic that goes to each one of those resources based on a weighting. And we can have latency-based routing, and that will direct traffic to the resource that is providing the least amount of latency for that end user. We can also have geolocation routing, which will route traffic for a user to the resource that is closest to their geolocation. We can also have failover routing. So in the event that our resources become unhealthy, we can direct traffic to another resource that is healthy. And DNS failover, that is enabled through Route 53 health check. So in the event that a health check fails, we can have Route 53 fail over to a healthy resource. So the types of health checks that are available, we can have health checks that monitor an endpoint, for example, a web server. We can have health checks that monitor CloudWatch alarms, and we can have health checks that monitor other health checks. For example, to maintain a minimum number of resources, we might have health checks on multiple resources, and that will enable us to achieve that. So there are different types of failover strategies that you can implement. So the first one being active and active failover strategy, and that is where you would route traffic from an unhealthy active resource to a healthy active resource. We also have active standby strategy, and that will route traffic from your unhealthy resource to a static site or a backup site. And a good example of that would be, for example, if you had an EC2 web server and that EC2 instance went down and became unhealthy, you could then have a static website created on Amazon S3, and you could fail over to that static website in the event that your web server went down. And that way your customers don't see something that is, or your end users don't see a blank screen on their screen. They just see a static site that really still has information available for them. So that is the end of the lecture on Route 53, and there will be a very in-depth lab on highly available and fault-tolerant architecture where we'll be implementing this. I'll see you in the next lesson.